Alright, today's lecture is going to be covering lifespan development. Development refers to the changes that happen throughout a person's life in terms of psychological, physiological, behavioral, socio-emotional, cognitive, and any other of the changes that may not have been listed, but things that change throughout one's life. These can be influenced by both nature and nurture. Nature is sort of your genetics and getting older and different developmental changes. Nurture is influenced by things outside of our body. They can be thought of as environmental factors. Alright, conception and prenatal development. Conception occurs when an egg is fertilized. After that, we have a zygote, which fuses to form the 23 chromosomes from both the male sperm and the female egg. The embryo occurs when the zygote attaches to the wall and then will last about 6 weeks. During this time, the amniotic sac starts to fill, where the embryo lives. A placenta forms, which allows the exchanging of nutrients, and it is considered an organ, and it is transferred, those nutrients, through the umbilical cord. It links the placenta to the fetus. Now, something to note is that fusing occurs between the sperm and the egg within several hours. It happens much more frequently than people realize. But what happens is lots of times it ends up not being viable, so the body rejects it. Alright, let's start talking about the fetus. Alright, so the fetus comes into occurring at about 9 weeks. The embryo, after they've done splitting all the cells and forming and reproducing, they become a fetus. A fetus will grow to be about 6 to 8 pounds, almost the size that it should typically be when they are born. As it goes through the progression, as you can see in the picture, everything starts to get bigger and bigger. Starts to look more and more like a human. The more arms, the head starts growing quite a bit. Everything starts to become more and more like what we think of as a baby. Now, during this time, teratogens can happen. Teratogens are harmful substances that cause, developmental issues. They include general environmental factors such as air pollution, radiation, but can also be caused by cigarettes, alcohol, drugs, and any other things that the mother may bring into their body. This is why it is recommended for mothers who are pregnant oftentimes not to ingest any types of drugs, because there's not the greatest amount of research on what is actually happening. One of the biggest issues is fetal alcohol syndrome, which is a condition caused by maternal alcohol drinking that can lead to numerous detrimental developmental effects, including limb and facial abnormalities, as well as intellectual disabilities. The current recommendation in the U.S. is not to have any alcohol at all whatsoever. However, our counterparts in Europe allow for a glass of wine a day. Part of the issue with fetal alcohol syndrome is the research on which it was based, in that it was based on severe alcoholic mothers, and we didn't have any control and randomized studies. However, it would be very hard to do any of those. That being said, the premise of which the results were based off of are questionable. That being said, though, probably still best to not drink and to follow your own doctor's recommendation and not somebody on a video. Alright, periods of development. We've got infancy, childhood, adolescence, emerging adulthood, early adulthood, middle adulthood, late adulthood. These have all been shifted throughout the past 20 to 30 years. Infancy still stays at about till 1 year of age. Childhood starts at the onset of puberty, but through different environmental factors, the onset of puberty has become earlier for some. Adolescence is the years between the onset of puberty and the beginning of adulthood. And this is actually expanded. It's sometimes said that adolescence now goes till about 24 years. Emerging adulthood, the period between puberty and adulthood, may last well into the 20s. And then we've got early adulthood, where things sort of start to stabilize. Whereas we were talking about in adolescence, things are going through lots of changes. Childhood is also pretty relatively stable. We're going through changes and growth, but not quite as turbulent as we will see in adolescence. Middle adulthood is roughly between ages 45 and 65, and we'll start to see declines. And we're no longer at our peaks once we start hitting middle adulthood. Late adulthood is where we start to see lots of declines, and that's considered for 65 and up. Let's talk about newborns or infants. Newborns have tons of reflexes that are innate, and some of them are really important and help us out quite a bit, such as the rooting reflex. This helps the baby turn towards what's touching its cheek, because it's normally what touches a baby's cheek is the mother, and it's trying to get the baby to feed or latch on while it's trying to breastfeed. There's the sucking reflex, which is also important, because if the baby didn't have this, it wouldn't be able to feed. Grasping reflex, cling to objects placed in its hands. The Moro reflex, where the baby spreads their arms and pulls them back in when they are startled. These reflexes start to go away as the baby gets older. Their sensory abilities are not quite yet fully developed at birth compared to other animals. Vision is the least developed sense. Newborn babies prefer human voices, and they specifically prefer their mother's voice over that of a stranger's, most likely because they've been hearing it the whole time they're in their womb. And they can also distinguish the smell between their mothers and others. As the child goes from infancy to childhood, those reflexes we were just talking about start to become more deliberate actions, meaning they can control them and they're not sort of reflexive. And they start getting these gross motor skills, such as sitting, walking, and crawling. They start to develop fine motor skills, which is doing small little movements, such like writing or using their fingers. Now, a child isn't going to write, but that's just to give you an idea of what a fine motor skill is. Now, fine motor skills develop throughout childhood and into adulthood. Another example of a fine motor skill is doing beading, where you take beads and you put it onto a string. This is a good activity for kids. Adolescence. One of the most turbulent times, as we have discussed. We start going through puberty. This is where we have primary sex characteristics that change, and our secondary, which are the ones that distinguish between the two sexes, help us figure out who is who. Primary are the ones that involve reproduction. During puberty is when women will go through their first menarche, sorry if I mispronounced that, which is their first menstrual period. Puberty matters. The timing matters. Early onset for girls is associated with more emotional problems, and also associated with issues for males as well. For girls, they are often viewed as older than they actually are. The problem with this is that they start attracting older crowds who are more developmentally advanced, and then start doing things that are more developmentally advanced and are inappropriate for their age. Males, this happens too, and they also start feeling different from each other. There's a lot of self-doubt that goes through both of the genders. Alright, so early and middle adulthood. 20s to 40s, relatively stable. Not much changes in terms of physical growth. There is a second growth spurt that happens in the late 20s, early 30s. But the body starts to slow down. Early onset of hearing loss, eyesight issues, recovering from a workout takes longer. Our bodies are just slower than they were before. Menopause starts to happen around age 50, can happen earlier. Late adulthood, reduced capacity to get oxygen, to absorb nutrients. Things slow down. The hearing starts to go. And we have a need to keep socializing. As you get older, it's just as important to socialize as when you were younger. It is one of the protective factors that keep you sane as you get older. Learning as well is still important. So learning new things, new ideas, book clubs, and the such are important in acting as protective factors as different brain-related issues start to creep up. In the next video, we will start talking about Erikson and Piaget.